The first knock came at 8 in the morning, right when the light hit the hood of my car, just so, and she stood there on the porch like she belonged to the neighborhood calendar, clipboard in hand, smile thin as tinfoil. "Mr. Mercer," she said, like she owned the name as much as she owned the rules. "That vehicle can't stay in plain sight. It lowers property values." I remember the way the sun caught the chrome and how ridiculous the whole thing sounded, like arguing a painting off someone's wall, but it was the look in her eyes that settled into me. Not just rule following, but hunger for control. That was the beginning. My car, a battered, stubborn, hand-restored 1969 Riverhawk, is more than metal to me. I built that thing in my garage over 3 winters. It's the sound of my dad's laugh and the peanut-scented upholstery. It's the stain on the carpet from when I totaled my first paycheck fixing the carburetor. It's the exact kind of thing that tells a story, and I tell stories the same way I tell the neighbors when they stop by: plain, honest, no pretension. So the idea of being told to hide it, or move it, or worse, to pretend it doesn't exist, felt like being asked to erase a part of myself. Evelyn Hart, HOA president, unofficial prosecutor, woman with an army of forms, gave me a violation notice that looked like a legal poem. Photographs attached, circled in red, language sharp and formal. In violation of community aesthetics, it read, "Please move or face fines." She had reasons, of course. She called it community standards. She said the Riverhawk was non-conforming. But when you peel the paper back, the reasons smelled less like law and more like something messier. Control, jealousy, the small cruelty of someone who equates their authority with the right to decide what other people can love. The first week, I tried to be reasonable. I emailed. I printed my registration. I brought out the binder of receipts and restoration photos like evidence in a trial of taste. I met her at a coffee meet and greet with cookies on the table and tried to put a human face on the car. "This was my father's," I said, and I thought that would be the end of it. Evelyn nodded like she was marking an item off her list and said, "Sympathy doesn't change code, Mr. Mercer." That was the way she spoke when she wanted to hurt you without raising her voice. What changed everything was the escalation that smelled faintly of planning: the late-night photos left under my windshield wiper, the sudden appearance of a private towing company's card slipped through my mailbox, the anonymous note taped to my front gate. Not above the rules. People began to look at me differently, not hostile, exactly, but curious, like someone watching a slow-motion fender bender, wanting to see what kind of mess I'd make. My neighbor Maya came by one afternoon with 2 cups of lemonade and a look that said she didn't want trouble, but didn't like what she'd seen. "She's done this before," she said quietly. "It's about power more than a car." So I started to document. Phone recordings, time-stamped photos, the kind of boring, obsessive proof you collect when you suspect you're being targeted. I talked to a lawyer, Ben Cole, who smelled faintly of motor oil and patience, and he told me something that felt like a lifeline. HOAs get away with a lot when people don't push back. Sometimes you need to make them show the rules are reasonable. He filed a request for official clarification. I called the State Preservation Office. It turns out some local ordinances protect vehicles of historic interest. The pieces were there: the law, the receipts, the neighbors who shrugged and watched, but Evelyn wanted a public spectacle. Her first public move was the meeting. The community center, folding chairs, fluorescent lights humming like a jury. She presented her case with photos and phrases made for a newsletter: non-conforming, liability, community image. I stood up, and I did something I never thought I would do. I told my story in front of people. I spoke about my dad, about staying awake in the garage, about the first time the Riverhawk started and rattled like an old dog's throat. I watched faces change. Some nodded, some scowled at the idea that a car could be a symbol of anything but eyesores. The vote failed by 2 people, and for a second it felt like a small, sweet victory. But Evelyn didn't like losing, and people like her don't go quietly. The next night, I heard the truck before I saw the lights, a low rumble at 3 in the morning, the kind that wakes you up with the wrong kind of certainty. I walked the yard in my pajamas and watched 2 silhouettes by the fence. They were dressed like workmen, but their movements were too deliberate. One of them flashed a clipboard, another had bolt cutters. I felt something cold and heavy inside, a panic I'd never known before, because this was no longer about forms or meetings. This was about property and boundaries and the breach of both. I started recording on my phone, leaned on the porch light like it was a lighthouse, and called out, "Hey, what are you doing?" They froze, and one of them, a man I'd seen at HOA meetings, a quiet sort of muscle on Evelyn's side, stepped forward, and his voice was low and clipped. "You need to move it," or he didn't finish. The clipboard flashed. For a beat, I wondered if this would end in middle of the night towing and a lawsuit. But I had the recording. I had witnesses now, because my neighbor Maya had slipped out in her robe and was standing behind me, and the flash of porch light had drawn someone else from next door. The men left. I knew then that staying quiet wasn't safe, that if I wanted to keep the Riverhawk and the small, stubborn identity wrapped up in it, I had to make this public in a bigger way than a community meeting. So I called Officer Lang at the preservation office and told him everything. He arrived in a plain car with the kind of subdued authority that says he's seen people fight over stranger things. He listened to the recordings. He looked at my binder. He sat in the Riverhawk and turned the wheel like he had to feel the thing to understand why I'd fight. He said, "We'll put a hold on any tow orders until this is sorted." That felt like a window opening. Evelyn responded by turning up the pressure in every other way she could. She called for a special committee. She sent more photos to people's inboxes. She began, quietly, to smear. "He keeps his car for attention," one email read. "He's flaunting." It's amazing how quickly community opinion can be nudged when someone with the right smile and the right title leans into gossip. There were whispers in the mailbox, comments at the coffee shop. Public shaming is quieter than a tow and almost as effective. The big moment came when Evelyn organized a neighborhood cleanup day, ubiquitous, wholesome, and arranged for the Riverhawk to be the figurative elephant in the center. She stood on a little folding table with a microphone and said, "We want things tidy. We want things standard." Her voice was honey and wire. Then she gestured at the car like a magician revealing a rabbit. "This," she said, and I felt all the air leave the room, "is the exact sort of thing that divides us." A man from the crowd, loud, flushed, eager to please, shouted the sort of thing people say when their throat has been prepared for outrage. "Take it away. We deserve uniformity." Someone else hissed, and the argument spiraled the way arguments do when they're fed. My hands shook. I wanted, desperately, to walk away to spare the old car and spare my neighbors the spectacle, but that would have been conceding to a principle I couldn't accept. I stepped forward. "This car is part of the community too," I said. "It's history. It's not hurting anyone." Evelyn's smile thinned, and she said, quietly, "History can be a nuisance." When the tow truck finally showed up, and it did, the morning after the cleanup, like a bureaucratic execution, it felt like a moment in a movie where everything tilts. The tow driver refused to hook the Riverhawk in front of the crowd. The preservation office had issued the hold. But Evelyn, furious and red-faced, accused me of evading the community and filed a complaint. She wanted my license revoked, my fines, my public humiliation. She wanted a victory that would taste like power. Instead, she got something else. The preservation office opened a formal review. The documentation I'd kept, receipts, photos, witnesses, recordings, mattered. Maya and a handful of neighbors testified on my behalf, not because they loved the car as much as I did, but because they didn't like where this was heading, a place where one person decided what everyone else could enjoy. The review found that my Riverhawk was, in fact, of historical interest, and that Evelyn's enforcement had overstepped in several places. They ordered a cease and desist on any further punitive action. Evelyn was not removed from life. She simply lost the force of a weaponized rule. The neighborhood breathed for a few days like it had been stuck underwater and finally surfaced. People leaned on their porches and talked about other things. I drove the Riverhawk slow around the block one evening and felt like the whole story was a bruise starting to fade. But the ending was not tidy. Evelyn did not apologize. She filed a different complaint that lingered like a shadow. People still whispered in the coffee shop. Some thought I'd been entitled. Others thought I'd stood up for something real. The Riverhawk stayed. I kept the receipts and the recordings, and sometimes, late at night, I would wash the glass and think about the way power can hide behind a smile. I think about Maya and Ben and Officer Lang, people who chose to step into the scene and do the small, stubborn things that tip the balance. We lost neighbors in the skirmish, and we kept some. We found new allies in unexpected places. I won the right to keep my car in the driveway, but I didn't win a moral tidy ending. Life rarely hands those out. So tell me, was I right to fight? Was Evelyn right to try to keep things uniform? Where do you draw the line between community rules and someone's right to preserve what they love? Drop a comment, tell me where you stand, and if you've ever had to defend something that mattered to you, even if it looked silly from the outside, I want to hear that story. Share, argue, and don't be afraid to look at both sides. Sometimes the truth sits exactly in the messy middle.